morning.
Morning.
We're still on the side of morning. So this is kind of an evolving project. So this is one section of a chapter of a larger project about Black women placemaking on Johns Island, and so it keeps changing. So bear with me here as we're in a new iteration of a chapter that I keep talking about. So this one is just jump in. So this is actually a photograph that I recently found of my great-grandmother. So when I went back home, I was preparing for another presentation and went through the photo album, which my grandmother guards with her life. And so while she was asleep, I went through the photo album, and I was like, I pulled all these photos out, and so this one in particular is really intriguing to me because it's my great-grandmother, who people say I look a lot like. And we have a very limited collection of photos with her in it. So one of the things that I want to talk about is this idea, a little bit of sartorial politics, but it's really less about the politics of what she's wearing as much as it is about clothing as kind of artifacts. So in the text of Black women writers, Melissa Cooper positions root-working women as individuals with, quote, the keen ability to see the past and the future, the dead and the living, the harvest the wisdom that this site cultivates in order to save their descendants, end quote. In toying with Cooper's conception of Black female characters as root-working women, I think about root-working as in, one example, conjure, or as people on Johns Island call it, to work root, with the spiritual and organic in an effort to heal, cure, curse, or hex, as well as root working in terms of farming, growing, sifting to get out of the ground, transplanting, and harvesting. So for me, root working is an island-based methodology that Black women use and have been using for planting and healing. It is a Black feminist methodology because it relies heavily upon Black women's ways of knowing and being, requires a very specific relationship to land and the people living on and with this land, understanding of plants as medicine and or antidote. This understanding is communal. People believe in healing and or harming properties of plants. So root working is a methodology that Black women showed me how to use for this project. I followed clues, networks, and guides across the South Carolina Sea Island. Women shared their long-standing friendships with me, introduced me to relatives, dead and alive, through their collection of VHS tapes, silences, stories, fragments of documents, faded and unmarked photographs, programs, and other artifacts. For those who may not know, the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands have been discussed as lands of hags and haints, land of Gullah Geechee people, land of African retention in the form of song, language, spiritual practice, and foodways. I think about how researchers and writers come to engage with the island almost as archaeologists, interested in studying human history through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artifacts. I'm thinking about Black women creatives as archaeologists who use their artistry to excavate, or maybe a less violent term like position, New York, Caribbean islands, and the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands as sites of Black life. Their archaeology teams are Black women and girl characters traveling through, into, and across islands, seeking parts of their own history, oftentimes guided by an older female ancestor, aunt or grandmother, who teaches them how to traverse the island landscape, a woman who's well-versed on what Brian Roberts and Michelle Stevens calls the insular real. 4 readings that may be at the forefront of our minds that does this work. Oh, one of them disappeared. It's okay. Is Julie Dash's Daughters of the film and book Daughters of the Dust. So that's the little green marker down here, which documents the life of the Pazant family living on Ebo Landing. Gloria Naylor's Mama Day, published in 1988, where Miranda Day travels through the self-sufficient fictional Sea Island community of Willow Springs, while her niece Coco travels between New York, New Orleans, and Willow Springs. Polly Marshall's 1983 publication, Praise Song for the Widow, which is up here in the orange, where A.B. Johnson traverses Martinique, Grenada, Carriacou, New York and Tatum, which is a community near Beaufort, and also references Igbo landing. And Ntozake Shange's 1984 publication, which is here and it's supposed to be here. Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, which gets us to Charleston and Dafuski Island. So collectively, these Black women creatives get us closer to the site of my project, Johns Island, which is the central location of Alice Childress' 1977 play Sea Island Song, later renamed Gullah, in 1984. In sitting with Childress' papers in the Schomburg, I learned that Childress reflected heavily upon stories published in this book here. Guy and Candy Carowin's 1966 publication, Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life, which documents the lives and music of Black Johns Islanders in the 50s and 60s. This book reaches in a few different directions for me, especially informing my understanding of island archives. First, the book is a part of my mother's collection, a book that she gifted me before I went to college. Somehow I have I have her book in my collection. I don't know where my book went. But this also became really transparent to me after receiving a dope chapter from Professor Figueroa about Maria Cotera's work around unpacking our mother's library for understanding the Chicana feminism movement. And so it made me dig back through most of these books, except for Drums and Shadows. Mama Day, When Roots Die, Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life are actually in my mother's collection. And so just how that helped me think about where we go and where our archives can exist. It was one of the few publications before the 1980 re-engagement with the Sea Islands that captured the stories and songs of Black Johns Islanders. I revisited Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life and sat with a passage from Miss Janie Hunter, where she talks about why she told stories to her children about growing up. And so it's a photograph of Miss Janie Hunter on the left, and Moving Star Hall Singers. So they're one of the main reasons why people came to Johns Island was to understand what was going on at the Moving Star Hall. It was a place people recorded spirituals. It was also kind of the birth of Black co-ops on Johns Island. So it was a group of working Black families that came together and tried to raise money for like insurance, for burials, if somebody got sick. And it's also a place where they worshiped. And so, although my biological relationship to Miss Janie Hunter is probably a distant one, we might be related through a series of marriages, she knew that we, the children who grew up on Johns Island, would come digging for our roots. And we did. So it'll make me think of Toni K. Bambara when she says, quote, "My grandmother used to say that if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, then the whole universe will accommodate itself to you. That is to say, if you're on the right track and you are committed and your intentions are clear, then you need to be passive because the information you need, the teachers you need, the people you need, the resources you need are going to come towards you, and all you have to do is be receptive," end quote. And so I'm becoming more receptive in this process, what led me into the living room of Miss Josephine, who is seated here. She is the grandmother of Jordan, CJ, Jakaya, Joshua, Jeremiah, Jasmine, Sierra, and Olivia. She's the mother of Nicole, Shauna, Cherie, and Rochelle, wife of Isaiah, daughter of Christina and Leon, granddaughter of Josephine Taylor, great-granddaughter of Miss Phoebe Taylor, who is in this photograph here. I start with the moment after wrapping up our more formal interview. As I turn off the camera and remove it from the tripod, Miss Josephine continues talking to me and walking away from where we're sitting. She stops, looks down at the white t-shirt she's wearing, and says to me, "I want this to be part of my story." Let's see if it'll go for us.
Wearing is the King Freeman family reunion shirt. And this shirt was made by one of my blind cousins who could not see. And this is original. And on the back is that. Okay? And let me go over here and show you.
She was like, and that's that. Thank you so much. Right? She didn't say nothing else after that. She was like, and now we're going to take this tour of my house. Right? And so during a visit to her home, we would often see her wearing a t-shirt that represented some part of her identity. The schools of her children and or grandchildren, annual church events, her local Eastern Star chapter, family reunions, and occasionally a shirt from a place where she or her relatives visited. By narrating or semi-narrating the image of her t-shirt during this visit, she transforms the shirt into an artifact and uses it to welcome us into an impromptu root working, digging up, earthing process. She waited patiently as I fumbled with the camera, and then she did what she did about the shirt. Her shirt marks the beginning of our tour through the artifacts of her home and serves as an invitation to engage and document other components of her life. The t-shirt represents a crucial part of Miss Josephine's life and identity and the lens through which I come to read John's Island, through which is family. For the remainder of this presentation, I invite you to follow Miss Josephine's lead and think through what emerges when we unpack the familiar as, quote, part of our story. What might be made visible about John's Island when we study the eclectic archive of Black women's t-shirts? I borrowed the term eclectic archive from Tanisha Ford, who assembled such from quote, correspondence, rare photographs, organizational papers, FBI files, and oral interviews, end quote, to excavate the understudied history of Africana women dressing fashionably in the quest for Black freedom, end quote. Family reunion t-shirts attempt to reclaim place, belonging, and history through a variety of markers. So these are 4 different t-shirts. The one on the top is another Simmons family reunion shirt where it's, on the front it's a Bible, and then on the back it's all of the children who would be Miss Josephine's brothers and sisters, and then their children are represented as chapters. So it may not have their name, but it'll say they have this many chapters as children. Then the bottom is Nancy and Prince Days. It's the front of a t-shirt. It's also the front of a program. So this notion of like trees, and then the idea of each one of the children being represented by leaves. And then this red t-shirt is is the Bunno family reunion, where on the front it has an image, but on the back it's also another tree that has similar representation. This is 1990s. So it's all the great grandchildren or the grandchildren of Ollie Bunno and James Bunno, and then all their children is just represented as like 7 children, this many grands. So just this idea of thinking about how people were making place and making genealogy markers in this idea of like t-shirts and trying to track this kind of movable history. But also this idea of placekeeping markers. So the front of the t-shirt, you see the palm tree, you see seashells and crabs, so representing the palm tree is actually the state tree for South Carolina. And also this idea that we're kind of gives you like an island, you kind of get this island aesthetic. I mean, I love crabs, so I'm all for it. But this is also an image that was used and recycled for about 3 different family reunions across about a 10-year span. And how it also starts to unpack and map this place. So when you put it alongside, this says Mullet Hall here, but now there's actually a space called Bunno Road. And so realizing that the front of the shirt is kind of setting up that this family belongs to, and their connection to this place. But also the back helps you unpack who would have lived in this kind of like stale version of a place, this kind of stale mapping. So it starts to add texture to that as well. And then my favorite part is also thinking about how t-shirts also open up a new conversation about placemaking. So recently, families came together and decided to do a Mullet Hall reunion. So it's this one kind of thoroughfare where all of these families have lived. And so the shirt lists all the families that ever lived there. Right now, of the families listed, I would say only 3 still live in that community. But also when you lay it on top of the actual archive and census. So we use this census because, as we know, Black families, when it comes to finding them and documenting them, it's been really complicated. So all the blue represent families that are actually on the shirt, but then there are some families who aren't on the census who actually lived in the neighborhood. So this is a 1930 census, and why this is key for me is this pink arrow right here. My grandmother, we cannot locate her birth certificate, but she shows up in the census as being born in 1929, even though there's documents that say that she was born in 1928. And so we've been trying to use this kind of document to prove that she was alive in 29, right? Because right here it says she would have been 10 out of 12, right? 10 out of 12 months old. So she wasn't even a year old yet, but it also identifies her as Isabel. My great-grandmother has no children named Isabel, so Maybelle shows up as Isabel. And so just thinking about how we can use these kind of family stories in order to rebuild and restructure a community and remember a community. And the very last part of this is a part where I'm thinking through t-shirts in order to reclaim my own kinds of history. I don't know what to do with these yet, but this is one family reunion t-shirt from 1999 where there's a map actually underneath of where family members live, but I was kind of toying with some things. So all of this is fabric that was given to me by Miss Robinson, Miss Josephine, because her mother was a quilter. And so she's like, I have all this fabric, you want it? And so I just was kind of thinking about what does it look like to kind of map on top of these kind of maps, putting on top of them Black women as the center, because that's who I was looking for. I was looking for my great-grandmother. So I started doing this in 2016 and have been kind of toying with it ever since. Then the last part is this idea of sightings. So Miss Josephine, I close with this. Miss Josephine taught me how to see the familiar. I started this project because I was deeply interested in learning more about Ollie Michael Bunno, my maternal great-grandmother, a woman who I so favor according to adults who grew up around her. She departed this life on Friday evening, March 12, 1976, at a local hospital, and left to mourn her passing 8 children, 5 daughters, 3 sons, and numerous grandchildren who remember her as, quote, always open-handed, end quote. Families in Mullet Hall remember her as a smiling and giving woman who was always ready and willing to give a helping hand. She offers a closed-lipped smile from the fireplace mantle of my mother and grandmother's house over the entertainment center of my aunt's house, from the 3rd floating black shelf of my aunt's house in South Ozone Park, New York. I'm learning to see her beyond the omnipresent photo, find her in the very places she's always been, such as here, seated at the dining room table of her daughter's house in Brooklyn, peering into the camera over the head of grandchildren. This photo opened up new conversations about the way Johns Island manifested in Brooklyn, Harlem, and Queens during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. With the guidance of my mother, Miss Josephine, and 7 other women I interviewed, this Constellation project pushes me to dig through the eclectic archives that Black women have constructed in order to draw and conceptualize more textured mapping of the Sea Island community. So I end with Vincent Brown and our relationship to and understanding of archives. When we shift our emphasis from historical recovery to rigorous and responsible creativity, we recognize that the archives are not just the records bequeathed to us by the past. Archives are also consist of the tools we use to explore it, the vision that allows us to read its signs, and the design decisions that communicate our sense of history's responsibilities. Thank you.